No one likes being around a complainer. They complain about everything. I'm reminded about the salesman that was making small talk with his barber, and knowing that his barber was from Italy, he said, "Hey, I'm going to be taking a trip to Italy soon." The barber stopped cutting and he says, "Really? Well, what airline are you taking?" And the salesman told him, and the barber said, "Oh, that's a terrible choice. They're late all the time. Their flight crews aren't very friendly. They lose luggage frequently." "Well, all right, I guess, but when are you going?" And the salesman said, "Well, I'm just going next week." And he says, "Oh, this is the worst time of year to go. You won't like the weather at all. I hope you at least found a nice place to stay." And the salesman told him the name of the hotel he'd be at. And he says, "Oh, I know that hotel. I haven't heard very good reports about it. I've heard that the beds are hard and the food's not very good and the walls are paper thin. Why would you put yourself through this? Why would you go there and fly on that airline and stay in that hotel?" And the salesman said, "Well, I've had several opportunities that have come up for me to conduct some business there." The barber said, "Oh, you're not going to be successful at all. The Italians are so difficult to do business with. I think that you're going to come away very disappointed." And then one more time, the salesman tried. He says, "Well, and I'm also going to be able to take a tour of the Vatican." And he says, "Oh, yeah, good luck with that. I don't think you're going to enjoy that at all. It's just a lot of pomp and ceremony, and it's just really not going to be your thing." A few weeks later, the salesman is back in that same barber's chair, and the barber asked him, "So how did your trip to Italy go?" And he said, "It went great. That airline, they were not only on time, they were actually early. The flight crew was amazing. They took care of me. The weather was absolutely perfect when I was there. And my hotel, it was like staying in a resort. Best bed I've slept in, best food I've eaten in a long time. I felt like I was on vacation, not there on business." And the barber said, "Whoa, that's kind of good. But speaking of business, how did your business deals go?" The salesman said, "Great. I signed more business than I was expecting to be able to sign up. It was absolutely amazing." And he said, "Let me tell you, when I took my tour of the Vatican, I was actually given an audience with the Pope." Now the barber is at a complete stop. He says, "The Pope, what was that like?" And he says, "Well, let me tell you, I was ushered into this room, and there he was sitting at the other end in all of his ceremonial dress, and it was very solemn, and I approached him, and I knelt down, and as he extended his hand to me, and I bent forward to kiss his ring, and when I did, he took my head in both of his hands, and he leaned down right next to me, and he said, my son, where did you get such an awful haircut?" See, the thing about complainers is they seldom look at themselves. They complain about just about everything else. They know how to raise your kids. They know how to run your business. They know how their local sports team can be victorious. They know how the politicians should be handling the different situations. In their so-called wisdom, they know how everything should work, and seldom do they receive anything back on themselves. They become almost impervious to any criticism or complaints that might come their way. Nobody really likes to be around complainers, because complainers can look around at something and it can be an otherwise perfect situation, but they'll find the one thing that's wrong. Look at that one thing, and they will find that one thing to complain about. I think complaining happens a lot for people because it's so natural to complain. The next time you're at the grocery store and you're standing in line waiting to pay for your groceries, just take a look at those magazines that are right there. What do the magazines have on the covers? Are they celebrating people, or are they criticizing? Oh, this celebrity stumbled here. This politician was caught in this scandal. This doomsday is coming. What about the next time that you turn on a news report? What are the lead stories? Are the lead stories celebrating something great, or are they telling you about some bad news? Hey, listen, friends. Those magazine publishers, they want to sell magazines. Those news stations, they want their eyeballs and ears. They want those tuned in there. Those websites, they want clicks. And they get them by leading with negative news. So apparently, they find it very natural for us to gravitate towards those things. So if I were to ask for a show of hands, if I were to say, how many of you like being around complainers? Put your hand up, please. I bet you didn't put your hand up. I think we'd be hard-pressed to look around and find somebody who would have listed down for them that one of the things that they like is, here's my list, I like being around complainers. Probably nobody raised their hand for that. So I need to ask you another question then. Why do you complain? Now listen, I'm preaching to myself first. I always preach these messages to myself first. So I had to ask myself, if I don't like being around a complainer, why do I complain? Why do I complain? If I don't want to be around that, why do I want other people to be around that? And I think that the reason is that when we complain, we think that we're justified in complaining. We think that there are special circumstances that allow us to complain. We make our case. Hey, listen, because of this and because of this and because of this, I get to complain. I don't want to be around other people who complain, but they don't have the same kind of situation. They don't have the same kind of hardship that I do. They don't have the same kind of setbacks that I've had. I have all of those things, and so I've earned the right to complain. You know, when we go to the book of Job, sure, Job had some difficulties, but listen to what he said in chapter 7. He starts off, "Does not man have hard service on earth? Are not his days like those of a hired man? Like a slave longing for the evening shadows, or a hired man waiting eagerly for his wages." And now he's going to make it personal. "So I have been allotted months of futility, and nights of misery have been assigned to me. When I lie down, I think, how long before I get up? The night drags on. I toss till dawn." Now listen to his list. It's going on here. "My body is clothed with worms and scabs. My skin is broken and festering. My days are swifter than the weaver's shuttle, and they come to an end without hope. Remember, O God, that my life is but a breath. My eyes will never again see happiness. The eye that now sees me will see me no longer. You will look for me, but I will be no more. As a cloud vanishes and is gone, so he who goes down to the grave does not return. He will never come to his house again. His place will know him no more." So he lists all of these things, 10 verses there in Job chapter 7. Listen to the circumstances I have. Verse number 11 starts off with, "Therefore." So in light of the complaints that I have here, therefore, here's what he says, "I will not keep silent. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul." See, that's really the answer to that question, isn't it? If none of us like to be around complainers, and then I say, well, if you don't like to be around complainers, then why do you complain? Or when I ask myself, why do I complain? Because then nobody wants to be around me. I think a lot of times we're like Job. We say, well, look at my list right here. Look at all of these special circumstances that just apply to me. And almost like that gives us a pass to be able to complain. Now, the Bible shows us some stories. God does not like complainers. He doesn't like when people complain. We read in Numbers chapter 11 this phrase, "When the people complained, it displeased the Lord." Pretty short and simple, right? When the people complained, it displeased the Lord. Why did they complain? Well, he had provided manna for them, but they complained because that wasn't good enough for them. They needed something else. They wanted some meat. They wanted some vegetables. Look at that same verse, Numbers chapter 11, verse 1. Look at how the Amplified Version brings it out for us. "Soon the people began to complain about their hardship, and the Lord heard everything they said. Then," this is a scary phrase, "then the Lord's anger blazed against them." He heard them complaining, and he said, "I don't like this. I've provided for you what you need, and you're complaining about it." Paul points out that what happened to them when God's anger blazed was a warning that we should take note of. He wrote this in 1 Corinthians, "And do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel." Now here's the warning for us. These things happened to them as examples, and were written down as warnings for us. I think the reason why God is angry, why his anger blazes against complainers, is a couple of reasons. The first one is because those complainers spread. It starts with a few, and then it just keeps on going. Now, in Numbers 11, where this is, these verses that we looked at, it tells us that the complaining started with what some translations call the rabble. And what that really is a group of Egyptians that followed the Jews when they left Egypt. It started with a small group. They began to go, man, okay, we got manna, but remember when we were back in Egypt and we had meat and we had vegetables? Wouldn't you like some of those too? And it began to spread throughout the whole community. Or what about when they got right to the edge, right to the border of the promised land, and the spies went in there and they came back? It was only 10 spies that began complaining, it's going to be awful. We can't go in there. Everything is against us. We look like tiny little grasshoppers and they're such giants. And then before long, you just a few verses down, it's the whole community is complaining and grumbling to Moses and to God. Why is this happening to us? Even Jesus had to deal with it. Now, in John chapter 7, John chapter 6, he's talking about this same story of the Israelites getting manna. And he says this is God's provision for them. And so he says in verse number 32, I tell you the truth, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. That was just, he said, that was a foretaste. That was just an example. It was just giving you a hint of what was going to happen, the real substance. And then Jesus says in just a couple of verses, he said, and I am that bread of life. It's me. That manna was pointing to me, and people had a hard time with this. And so then in verse number 41, it says, at this, the Jews began grumbling about him because he said, I am the bread of life. They began to say, oh, wait a minute. We've got it figured out. We know how it's supposed to work from here. And then Jesus even warns them. He says this, stop grumbling among yourselves. Stop this complaining because this is going to come back to hurt you. My Father's anger blazes out at people that are complainers, and then it begins to spread, and it even infects some of the disciples of Jesus. In verse number 60 of that same John chapter 6, on hearing it, many of the disciples of Jesus said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And then listen, the next verse, aware that his disciples were complaining about this, Jesus said to them, does this offend you? Does this offend you? Now, that's one of the reasons why I think God's anger blazes out at people that are complaining, is because it starts with just this small little rabble, and then like cancer cells, it just spreads. But I think that the other reason why it gets God's anger is because it takes people's eyes off of him and onto the problems. It takes people's eyes off of God and onto the problems right here. Remember, I said earlier that in a otherwise really beautiful setting, the complainers find the one lousy thing to complain about. So the Israelites, they hadn't been in the wilderness that long with the manna that is being provided for them. It's being provided for them. Miraculous food is showing up for them every day. And instead of being grateful for that, they complain about the one thing. Well, wish we had some meat. And so that's the other reason why I think God's anger blazes out against the people that complain, is because not only does it spread, but it takes people's eyes off of God and puts it down here on the problem. Even if there's just one problem, that's where their focal point is going to be. So I thought that as we're coming into this season of Thanksgiving, that we remind ourselves that it's not just supposed to be Thanksgiving Day, but it's supposed to be the reminder that we should be people of giving thanks all the time. And so we've called this series The Great Attitude of Gratitude. And you can see it in the word gratitude. You see the GR attitude, the great attitude. And people that live with gratitude, grateful people, really stand out from the crowd, don't they? Like we said a few minutes ago, I think it's very natural to begin to complain about things. But people that don't complain, people that are grateful for even maybe the one good thing in an otherwise lousy situation, those people stand out. It gets people's attention. Like the Apostle Paul. He wrote this letter to the church at Philippi. And these Philippians had known Paul a couple of different times that he had visited with them. And this whole letter of Philippians is a letter that is just bursting with gratefulness, with thankfulness. When you're reading through here, you'll find just this gratitude just bursting out. In fact, it's right at the beginning. Paul starts his letter off and says, hey, it's me, Paul. I'm writing a letter to my friends here at the church of Philippi, and verse number 3. So he's just given the introduction to the letter, and verse number 3, you can see the gratitude bursting out when he writes this. I thank my God every time I remember you. I thank my God every time I remember you. And then he just goes on. He says, I thank you that you've been involved in my ministry. I thank you that you've helped me, that you've provided hospitality, that you've provided financial resources to help me with my ministry. I'm grateful for the way that the word of God has come into your community and then spread from there. He just goes on and on about, I'm so grateful for this. And he knew what he was talking about. Because if you go back to the book of Acts, the very first time that Paul comes to visit this city of Philippi, it didn't go so well for him at first. The story is told in Acts chapter 16, and it says that Paul and his companion Silas, they are walking through the city, and there is a slave girl who is demon-possessed. There are some men who own this slave girl, and they are making money off of her. They're allowing her to stay trapped in this demon possession just so that she can tell people's fortunes, and they're earning money off of this. But it breaks Paul's heart to see her in this state, and so he turns around and he commands the demon to leave this girl. And so then these guys are upset, and they said, we've just lost a handsome amount of money because this girl is no longer enslaved by a demon. Can you imagine how awful that would be, that this girl has now been set free? But they go to the city officials and they said, hey, listen, these guys are robbing us of our livelihood, and they're just turning the world upside down. We're all going to be out of a job soon. And without any evidence, without Paul ever getting a chance to present a defense, there was never a court of law. It was just mob rule. They take Paul and Silas, they beat them like they're already guilty, and throw them into prison like they're already guilty. And so here's Paul and Silas in prison, unfairly accused, unfairly charged, unfairly punished. And we come to these two verses in Acts chapter 16. Upon receiving such orders, the jailer put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in stocks. Okay, so they can't even get into a comfortable position because they're just locked in there. About midnight, Paul and Silas were complaining about, that's not what it says. They weren't complaining. They weren't organizing a rally. They weren't giving the city of Philippi a bad review on Yelp. They weren't doing any of those things. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. And then I love this next phrase that it says, and the other prisoners were listening to them. They're praying and singing, and the other prisoners are listening to them. See, what Paul and Silas demonstrate for us is this truth. In a lousy situation, in an unfair situation, in a dark situation, What gratitude does is say, God is still God. Despite these circumstances, God is still God, and he is still worthy of the very best praise that I can give him. He is still worthy of that praise. And so here they are, praising and singing. And the other prisoners are listening. So here's this letter that Paul writes to the Philippians, and right in the middle of the letter, he has another word to say about complaining. Most translations, the kind of modern translations, will say, Paul in Philippians chapter 2, verse 14, do everything without complaining. But I like the way that the King James Version says it here. It says it like this: do all things, not just the good things, the pleasant things, the happy things, but do all things without murmurings and disputings. Murmurings and disputings, those are not words that we typically use. The word there in the Greek for murmurings really means kind of what I had defined it as before, is saying, let me sift through all of this stuff and find the things that I don't like. Let me look over here. The stuff's pretty good, but here's a bad thing over here. Let me complain about this thing. Let me bellyache about this thing. And you're seeking those things out. Now, I think the Apostle Peter would agree with the Apostle Paul in what he wrote in 1 Peter. He said this: so then those who suffer, so even if you're going through a hard time, those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue to do good. Continue to do good. Don't complain about it, but just say, I'm going to continue to do good, because God is still God and he is still worthy of praise, and I'm still going to walk this out. But there's this other word here: do everything without disputings as well. Now, this word here is in the Greek language. When you go out through the New Testament, it almost always is translated for the idea of internal dialogue. Most of the time, it'll get translated as this in English: evil thoughts. Evil thoughts. So in other words, when those complaints come out of your mouth, that's just the ugly weed. The root is inside here. So when you and I complain about something, we don't need a vocabulary change. We need a heart change. When we hear ourselves complaining, that should prompt us to get on our knees and say, Holy Spirit, what is it inside of me? What are the disputings inside of me? What are the evil thoughts inside my heart and my mind that allowed this complaining thought to sneak out? So we do our best sometimes to say, I'm going to zip my lips. So, we might say this. Maybe your parents or your grandparents said to you, well, if you can't say something nice about somebody or about that situation, then don't say anything at all. And so maybe we follow that advice. Maybe we cover our mouth and go, just not going to say anything here. And yet those evil complaining thoughts are still rumbling around inside of our heart and inside of our mind. And so when Paul says here, do everything without this murmuring and this disputing, he said, don't let the words come out, but also don't let them even stay inside and rumble around inside your heart. The writer of Hebrews captures the same idea about the root that's inside that needs to be dealt with when he writes this: see to it that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and to defile many. That's what we said earlier about complaining. The reason why God's anger blazes out against complainers is because it can start with just the rabble. It can start with just the one, and then it can begin to spread and it can defile others. In fact, let me show you that same verse out of the Amplified Bible, and you'll see the idea of how this can spread. It says this: exercise foresight and be on the watch to look after one another, to see that no one falls back from and fails to secure God's grace, his unmerited favor and spiritual blessing, in order that no root of resentment, rancor, bitterness, or hatred shoots forth and causes trouble and bitter torment. And then here's this same phrase here, and the many become contaminated and defiled by it. So let me repeat that again, friends, what we said earlier. In a lousy, dark, unfair situation, gratitude says God is still God and he is still worthy of abundant praise. So if complaining starts with one person and spreads, isn't it true that complimenting could do the same thing? See, when Paul and Silas here at midnight, when they're praying and singing hymns to God, what are they doing? They're magnifying God. No, that idea of magnifying doesn't mean that we make God bigger. God can't get bigger. He's already infinite. But magnifying means that we have focused in on him. Think about a telescope. If I wanted to look at the moon through my telescope, I would focus on the moon. What happens to anything that's close to me? I can no longer see it. The telescope doesn't show me the things that are close to me. It shows me the far distant thing, the bigger thing that I have focused on. And when we choose, like Paul and Silas here, when we choose to be worshipers instead of complainers, when we choose gratitude over grumbling, we are focusing on God. And remember, we said that earlier. The reason why God gets angry at our complaints is because it takes the focus off of him and puts it on this problem. Well, when we praise God, when we magnify God, it does just the opposite. It takes our focus off the problem and puts the focus on God. And we don't see this other stuff. And so when the other prisoners were listening to them, it's almost like Paul and Silas looking through that telescope, focused on God, like they are saying to the other prisoners, hey, do you want to see what I see? Come and look through my telescope. Look at what I see. Look at this. And when you do, when your focus is on God, all of this stuff, the dark cell, the lousy situation, the beating, the false accusations, the no trial, the having their legs locked into stocks, all of that, I don't see that anymore because I'm not focused there. I'm focused on God. I'm magnifying him. That's where my focus is. And I'm saying to other people, hey, take a look. Look through my telescope. Look at what I see over here. So friends, let me ask you, if gratitude could start with you, could you be the one person this week that when other people are complaining and grumbling, that you don't get caught up in that, but instead you say, let me focus on God. Let me magnify him. Could you be the person this week that catches when there's maybe a complaint that sneaks out past your lips, and then you say, ooh, that's an ugly weed. Holy Spirit, what are the disputings? What are the evil thoughts that are rumbling around inside me? Will you help me deal with what's here so that I don't have that ugly weed coming out anymore? See, friends, the person that has the great attitude of gratitude does stand out from the crowd. There is an authority to what they do. There's an attractiveness to the way that they live their lives. Because we said it earlier, if I would ask you, okay, everybody put up a show of hands if you like being around a complainer, nobody's going to put up their hand. And so when we're not complaining, but we are grateful people, when we're magnifying God, it sets us apart and people say, that's not what I was expecting. What I was expecting here was a complaint from you because this is a lousy, dark, unfair situation and I want to complain and I would expect you to join me in those complaints. But instead, I hear you giving gratitude to God. I see you focusing on him and tuning out this other stuff. When you do that, it makes your life a living, breathing testimony. It makes other people say, I want to stop looking at this stuff down here. I want to raise my eyes up and look through the telescope the way that you are. So let's do that. Not just during this season of Thanksgiving, when people are going to sit around and say, here, let me share something with you that I'm thankful for. But let's be people of gratitude all the time. Your gratitude is going to set you apart from the crowd, and it's going to glorify God. So try that this week. As always, friends, if you have comments, questions, please leave those below or reach out to me. I love to be able to dialogue with you. God bless you, friends. Looking forward to hearing great reports as you choose gratitude over grumbling, the great attitude of gratitude. God bless you. I love you.